So the last of the flipped classroom videos, make sure you take notes and prove that you took notes by uploading that to Google Classroom. So let's talk about the end of the Cold War. We're going to save the modern age for after the SOL. I'll give you the things you absolutely have to know. I think the rest, it'll be much better to do in person. So first, something that we have glossed over, and I want to make sure it gets included, is that the fear of communism coming to here in the United States has been around since the 1920s. In each of these cases, we call them Red Scares. In the 1950s, it hits its peak with Senator Joe McCarthy. Joe McCarthy said that he had a secret list of communists, first in Hollywood, then in the government, finally in the army, when people finally said, whoa, whoa, we show us the list. And of course, he never showed any list because no list ever existed. But people believed him for long enough that it ruined many, many lives. So first, a video on McCarthy and McCarthyism. McCarthyism is usually a shorthand term for any kind of witch hunt scare tactic related to Joe McCarthy, or related to trying to hunt out people for things that they haven't actually done.
Hi, this is Yahoo Williams. I'm a historian, and here's what you need to know in order to sound smart about Joseph McCarthy. During the 1940s and 1950s, many Americans worried about the prospects of communism rearing its head within the United States. Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin was one of the key political figures to capitalize on these fears. In 1950, he gave a salacious speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, in which he claimed to have evidence of 250 communists active in the United States Department of State. Despite the lack of evidence corroborating McCarthy's claims, he nevertheless continued to captivate the American public for the next 5 years. During this period, McCarthy hurled allegations that well-known authors, activists, and government officials were actually traitors and communist sympathizers. This was known as red baiting and often consisted of McCarthy hurling allegations of suspected communist involvement and forcing people to respond and to defend their innocence, even though they had not been proven guilty. It's not until McCarthy turned his attention to the United States Army in 1954 that his reign of terror came to an end and he was censured by the United States Senate. The American people were treated to the full terror of McCarthyism after the Army hearings were televised. In an infamous exchange during those televised hearings, in which McCarthy attacked a young Army officer, the Army's chief counsel thundered at the senator, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" which encapsulated the turn against McCarthy in this period. By the time the televised Army hearings ended, McCarthy lost much of his popular support. He died in 1957, just a short time later, at the age of 48.
So it wasn't just McCarthyism. Along with it was the House Un-American Activities Committee, in which people like Richard Nixon really got their start politically. This was a more political, more official, investigatory side of this paranoia about communism.
Hi, my name's Yahoo Williams. I'm a historian, and here's what you need to know in order to sound smart about the House Un-American Activities Committee. Founded in 1938, the House Un-American Activities Committee represents one of the darkest chapters of American history. At the end of the Second World War, the United States found itself in an ideological conflict with its former ally, the Soviet Union. Concerned that communism would spread in the United States, the House Un-American Activities Committee stepped up its efforts to ferret out and expose communists within the government and all other aspects of American life. What the House Un-American Activities Committee could do was ask those whom it believed to have belonged to subversive organizations to come before the body to explain themselves. If one chose to plead the Fifth Amendment, as many did, it could be seen as a sign of guilt. And many individuals, by virtue of the fact of not testifying, were imprisoned for contempt. If one, however, chose to testify, the body would often push the person to name others or to identify other organizations or persons whom they deemed to be subversive. Very quickly, the activities of the House Un-American Activities Committee descended into a witch hunt. with the government targeting people with very little evidence. In 1969, the House Un-American Activities Committee was renamed the Committee on Internal Security. That renaming came during a decade when the House Un-American Activities Committee had lost influence and power. And in 1975, it was finally disbanded.
So it's important to refresh that paranoia defines the Cold War, about communism coming here, and ultimately behind all that is the fear of the bomb, the fear of attack, the fear of the world being destroyed. So let's refresh our presidents. You should know these, we've gone through them, but let's have one-stop shopping so that you have that all here. You have your ones from the 1920s, with Woodrow Wilson winning World War I, the 20s being cool with Coolidge, then hard with Harding, and finally it's sucking with Herbert Hoover. Then we get Franklin Roosevelt, who had 4 terms, the New Deal, and World War II. He is a beloved figure. Harry Truman drops the atomic bombs, fires Douglas MacArthur to show that civilians are in charge. He's all about containing communism, and we have the Truman Doctrine that talks about containing that communism. Dwight Eisenhower, I like Ike. He was very big for racial integration with the Little Rock Nine. Had interstate highways built. That is his greatest lasting legacy. And he is the one who starts NASA, which we'll talk about more after the SOL. John F. Kennedy focused on foreign affairs, confront communism, Ich bin ein Berliner, everyone should come to Berlin and see. He has the issues with Cuba and the Cuban Missile Crisis. He announces that we should push for the moon, and he is assassinated in Dallas, Texas, in 1963. Continuing, Lyndon Johnson, a strong Texas Democrat, takes over after Kennedy, escalates Vietnam, signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but he announces that he won't run again. Richard Nixon, the anti-hippie, the pushback, opens communist China. He has the Watergate scandal in which he tried to maintain power. He is the only president to resign the office. And Gerald Ford, who was never elected, he was Speaker of the House, then the Vice President resigned, and so he moved up, and then the President resigned, so he moved up. He pardons Nixon, and is generally known as a buffoon. In his words, I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln. He's talking about cars, but it is so perfect. Then comes Jimmy Carter. He was a peanut farmer from Georgia. He served in the U.S. Navy. When he was elected, he pardoned those who dodged the draft for Vietnam and just basically made a big thing of everyone should come home. All sorts of problems hit their worst with Carter. I don't think Carter was that bad of a president, but everything was bad under the Carter as president. Inflation was by far the biggest issue. Inflation is when your money is worth less. A dollar doesn't buy what it's used to. We saw it go out of control in Weimar Germany, printing more and more and more money. Well, if it happens on its own as well, as I'm sure you can say even the last couple years, that a dollar doesn't buy what it's used to. There were a couple key ideas of whip inflation now, trying to change things, and all of it really was centered around oil. Oil is everything to modern society. If oil prices go up, well, that means the cost of driving goes up. And that, okay, you can drive less, but there are certain things that need to be driven, and that means the cost of shipping goes up. It costs more to send something across the country, which means the cost of every good that is shipped across the country goes up. Everything in stores, everything you buy. Plastics are oil-based. That's all petroleum. So it costs of materials to make the stuff that they're shipping goes up. So double whammy there on the prices. You spend the same, but you're buying less with your paycheck, which means manufacturers aren't making as much if you're still buying the same, but it's worth less. That means those manufacturers can't pay workers as much, which means that paychecks shrink for those workers, which means that you, the person receiving the paycheck, buys even less, and then manufacturers aren't making as much, and so on. Vicious cycles, all tied to oil. And the main head behind this was OPEC. OPEC is still around. It is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, mostly of the Middle East. They control how much oil is on the market. They control the supply, And even though the demand really changes only little bits, if they control the supply, they control the prices. And whenever they start tightening things up in the 1980s, the late 1970s, early 1980s, this leads to major shortages of gasoline in the U.S. I want you to pay attention to the prices in this next clip, because he says some things about the prices over the past couple years, and it is staggering.
Good evening. OPEC hit the rest of the world today with the biggest.
Good evening. OPEC hit the rest of the world today with the biggest price increase in 5 years. OPEC oil will now cost from $18 to $23.50. OPEC was founded in 1960. The new price is 1,000% higher than the price back then of $1.80 a barrel. Under the new pricing system, the moderate Saudis will be able to charge the lower price, while the more radical Libyans, for example, can charge the higher price. Either price means a bigger headache for the oil consumers. Here's Mike Jensen in Geneva with the details.
The OPEC ministers ended their three-day meeting today, and their Secretary General, Rene Ortiz, announced a huge increase in the price of crude oil, almost 15%. The new price will average about $20 a barrel. The Saudis will charge $18, others up to $23.50. The increase will be felt quickly at gasoline stations around the world, about 6 cents a gallon, the same for heating fuel. And it will deliver a sharp blow to the economies of the United States and other industrialized countries, increasing the risk of a worldwide recession. Sheikh Yamani of Saudi Arabia warned that even though there was a new price ceiling, it might not last too long.
Yeah, for the time being, it's a commitment. But for how long it will hold, it depends on you as a consumer.
Will the new price hold for the rest of the year?
I will cross my finger for that.
Sheikh Yamani put much of the blame for the price increase on the industrial countries, particularly the United States, for not cutting back on oil consumption. That keeps the market tight and puts upward pressure on prices. The irony is that OPEC is calling for the United States to reduce its high rate of consumption. But it's that same consumption that keeps the market tight and allows OPEC to keep raising prices. The OPEC countries stand to make an extra $13 billion in the next 6 months from today's increase.
The mannerisms of the Saudis, that was not very welcome to Americans who were struggling. So Jimmy Carter takes it head on, and he takes a page out of another favorite president. He has his own fireside chats. However, these were received a little differently. Think about some of the things he's talking about in this next clip.
Good evening. Tomorrow will be 2 weeks since I became president.
Good evening. Tomorrow will be 2 weeks since I became president.
On February 2nd, Carter addressed the nation in a fireside chat on energy. The country had been through an oil scare in 1973. To head off a new crisis, Carter appealed directly to Americans to rally around a new program.
All of us must learn to waste less energy. Simply by keeping our thermostats, for instance, at 65 degrees in the daytime and 55 degrees at night, we could save half the current shortage of natural gas. If we learn to live thriftily and remember the importance of helping our neighbors, then we can find ways to adjust.
Carter led by example. He curtailed the use of limousines, canceled magazine subscriptions, unplugged television sets, and put the presidential yacht, Sequoia, on the auction block.
We turned off the air conditioners, and it was so hot in the White House, people would come in there. It was unbelievable. It would be 100 above in there.
To save on staff overtime, all White House functions would end at midnight. No hard liquor would be served.
Jimmy Carter is a low church Protestant where it's a sin not to have a hard wooden bench to sit on in church.
1 year, the American economy had spun out of control. In 1 year, the American economy had spun out of control. Gasoline prices had more than doubled. Mortgage rates pushed 20%. Unemployment kept on rising.
There are just so many forces at work. When inflation becomes rampant, interest rates are high, and the business cycle is turning against you, it becomes almost impossible.
Inflation. Of all the problems facing the nation, most Americans now agreed inflation was the most urgent. In the summer of '79, fueled by rising oil prices, it surged to 14%.
Inflation makes you doubt the future. When you have inflation, you don't see as much building going on, you don't see as much investment going on, you don't see as much hiring going on. People weren't seeing their savings growing. And as a matter of fact, people were terrified that inflation would impoverish them in their old age.
Carter acted decisively. To reduce the budget deficit and bring inflation under control, he cut into social programs. New realities, explained the White House, must temper our nation's commitment to the poor.
It stirred up a hornet's nest of opposition from the Ted Kennedy people, from the traditional FDR coalition. They were very, very angry.
African American leaders felt betrayed and vowed to wage an all-out fight on what they called Carter's immoral, unjust,
Then came
and
the Iranian
inequitable
Revolution.
budget
Not
cuts.
only were there problems at home, but problems abroad would also mar the Carter presidency. In 1978, it comes the Iranian Revolution. So we, the Americans, put the Shah in charge of Iran in 1953. That was all part of containment, put someone pro-capitalist, pro-America in charge of Iran. When the Shah was ill, the country started pushing back because the Shah was not very well liked, and radical elements found success. Again, when people are desperate, they will turn to all sorts of dictatorship. Ayatollah Khomeini leads the fundamentalist Islamic revolution. He implements Sharia law and basically takes Iran to a very strict Islamic state. For past actions, including putting the Shah in power, Iran is now hostile to the United States. Well, that Shah is still ill, and Jimmy Carter welcomes the Shah to the United States to receive medical treatment. Carter is a devout Christian. He believed in helping anyone for any reason, no matter what the politics were. This did not go over well in Iran. Iran was very upset. Riots in the streets, upset. Burning American effigies, upset. It was not good. Indeed, mobs would swarm the American embassy in Tehran, and 66 hostages were taken. Those 66 hostages were kept for 444 days, though there would be a handful of exceptions. For the most part, those hostages are kept for over a year. Overall, Carter would lose the election, this being a large part of it, just America feeling helpless. But Carter was negotiating with Iran until he left for the inauguration. The day he was no longer president, he was on the phone negotiating with Iran until he left to go see Ronald Reagan get sworn in. And as soon as that was over and Carter was out, the hostages were freed, which was certainly a personal thing for Jimmy Carter. But there is one bright moment in all of this, and some of you may laugh, but it matters. One of the few times where sports really is center stage in politics, and that's called the Miracle on Ice. The 1980 Olympics, the Summer Olympics in 1980 were in Moscow, and the United States boycotted those Olympics. And so the 1980 Winter Olympics, which were held the same year at that time, were in Lake Placid, New York. And we all wondered whether or not the Soviets would boycott our Olympics. So in the middle of all of this awfulness going on, oil crises, inflation, the Iranian hostages, America is really in a bad spot. And so the U.S. Olympic ice hockey team, all amateurs by rule, take on the Soviet Union team, the greatest team in the world, the team that has won every gold medal since 1956. This is the single greatest moment of U.S. sports history, and I mean in all sports. If you don't believe me, let's take a look at the clip.
Check out the celebration in Lake Placid on Saturday, marking that amazing moment 35 years ago today when America's Check out the celebration in Lake Placid on Saturday, marking that amazing moment 35 years ago today when America's ragtag Olympic hockey team stunned the Soviet juggernaut and sent a jolt of joy all across America with an upset for the ages. ABC's Ryan Smith puts that miracle on ice in our Sunday spotlight.
It was the height of the Cold War.
The Soviets ignored President Carter's deadline for a troop withdrawal.
Tension soaring. But for 2 weeks in 1980, the entire world shifted focus to a remote town in upstate New York.
With these 13 games of winter,
where the U.S. hockey team would carve out a surprising spot in Olympic history.
The Soviets were the hopes of their country, but they were also big favorites, so everybody expected them to win.
Legendary sports announcer Al Michaels remembers the Lake Placid games were in the Cold War's shadow from the start.
What better place to play out a Cold War than on a sheet of ice in Lake Placid, New York?
But for U.S. team captain Mike Eruzione, the focus was only on the game.
For us, it was still a hockey game. It had nothing to do with what was happening globally. But the crowd, their reaction was us against them, freedom versus communism, the threat of a Cold War. Once we did get to the medal round, it was like one day of, oh my God, the United States is playing the Soviets. And then I think the political aspect came into play even more.
Still, the odds weren't on the American side until they dropped the puck.
When they tied the game 3-3 in the third period, now you're thinking, well, wait a minute, anything can happen. And Mike Eruzione scores with 10 minutes to go. Now it's 4-3. Now it's like, what are we seeing here? Can this really be?
As the clock wound down, those final seconds of an improbable American win became an iconic moment in sports and U.S. history. Al Michaels captured it in one of the greatest calls ever.
5 seconds left in the game. You believe in miracles? Yes!
The word that came into my head was miraculous. Miraculous got morphed into a question, and there you have it. That just came out of my heart, as simple as that.
I kept saying, I can't believe we beat the Russians. I can't believe we beat the Russians. And the celebration was incredible.
After that game, it made you want to hug your television set. I mean, it just made the country feel so much better about itself.
The game, forever dubbed the Miracle on Ice, a win for the ages, spanning beyond sports.
It's so different than so many other things that we remember. If you're old enough, you remember Pearl Harbor, JFK's assassination. We knew where we were when the Challenger blew up in 1986, and obviously we all remember September 11th, 2001. Those were all terrible events. When you think back to Lake Placid, it's a beautiful event. So it's one of those things where people say, yeah, I remember where I was, and they do it with a big smile on their face. That's a different deal.
For this week, Ryan Smith, ABC News, New York.
That was invented there. That's the first time it's ever been recorded. It was at the 1980 Winter Olympics, and that hockey game against the Soviets. That's how big it was. Let's switch back to politics. Ronald Reagan is our next key figure. In his youth, he was a sports announcer and an actor. He led actors' unions. He was a natural leader. He fought in World War II. Early in his life, he was a Democrat, but he switched in 1968 with Barry Goldwater. That's when the parties finished switching. The Republican Party staying the party of business, but that at that point meant less government, smaller, less involvement in daily lives of Americans, away from the pro-tariff movement that it was for so long. And he was governor of California. So the conservative revolution is not something that is super well defined, but it definitely did happen. Since FDR and the Great Depression, the power of government has increased and increased. FDR made government get so much bigger with all of those programs to get people working, the alphabet soup of the New Deal, and so on. It's only gone up and up and up. And so taxes increased and increased to pay for all of that, but it's never enough. There's always more push for international involvement, as we were involved with World War II, and then the United Nations, which includes Korea and Vietnam and all these things. And there's all this more and more cultural liberation, those darned hippies. And so eventually there was meant to be a push back. Reagan is the pushback. They called it the silent majority, and that was all those people who maybe weren't saying stuff in that, everything's changing too quickly, but were definitely there and thinking it, and they felt that those were most Americans who were there thinking it. They wanted more traditional values, they wanted less government, they wanted less taxes, they wanted businesses to be less taxed, and so on. So, and you can see where Let's Make America Great Again got its start with Ronald Reagan. This is also sometimes referred to as the Reagan Revolution. Reagan had led to tax cuts, and something that's sometimes called Reaganomics or voodoo economics. There's a sweet spot where if you keep overtaxing and overtaxing, eventually people will stop trying to make that much money because they're just going to lose too much of it in taxes. So there is a sweet spot where you reduce taxes, people will then do more and be more productive, and therefore you will get more tax revenue. And many people are like, there's no way that you can reduce taxes and make the government more money. It's voodoo economics. There's no way you can make that happen. And yet it really, really does. It works. There is a sweet spot. You cannot tax things and keep increasing taxes and keep increasing revenues. Eventually, people will pop. Less regulation for business to deal with. A lot of businesses not getting started or not getting off the ground because there were so many rules and laws. Reagan cut through a lot of it. He appointed a lot of judges and justices who exercised judicial restraint, anything to make government smaller and keep government out of our lives. He reduced the number of government programs. They focused on spending the military. Reagan is still affecting our politics today. And if you wonder if this was popular, look at the election results from Reagan versus Walter Mondale. That is the most one-sided election in history. Walter Mondale only winning his home state of Minnesota. It's intense. Let's take a deeper look at Ronald Reagan.
By 1980, conditions for a conservative majority had fallen into place. By 1980, conditions for a conservative majority had fallen into place. An attractive presidential candidate in Ronald Reagan and an incumbent Democrat deeply unpopular over a weak economy and the Iranian hostage crisis.
Can anyone compare the state of our economy when the Carter administration took office with where we are today and say, keep up the good work? Can anyone look at our reduced standing in the world today and say, let's have 4 more years of this?
The biggest challenge at the convention in Detroit was finding a running mate who could help Reagan win. Speculation from anchors like David Brinkley centered on a dream ticket, joining Reagan with former President Gerald Ford.
You can walk 3 feet here and hear 3 rumors about the vice presidential nomination, mainly because that is about all there is for anybody to talk about.
Reagan didn't pick Ford or need him to win the election.
If George Bush
in selecting another Republican, Reagan helped produce not just one successor named George Bush, but 2.
We are going to put an end to the notion that the American taxpayer exists to fund the federal government. The federal government exists to serve the American people.
For a lot of Americans, Ronald Reagan, this cowboy, sort of came out of nowhere. Ronald Reagan spoke the language of the common man. He didn't lead the life of a common man. He was a very well-to-do actor, but he could connect with the common man. If you look back at the 20 years that preceded his election, they are incredibly turbulent years. A president assassinated, Vietnam, the failure of Watergate and the Nixon presidency, on and on and on. The 8 years of his presidency did bring about a sort of a return to normalcy in American political life.
You can see heroes every day going in and out of factory gates. Others, a handful in number, produce enough food to feed all of us and then the world beyond.
Ronald Reagan used to say that the real heroes in America,
were the people who got up on Monday and went to work to earn the money to raise their family and went home in the evening and focused on helping their children grow up. And that the time they spend as citizens on their own family, on their own career, on paying taxes and earning a living and being productive was, in fact, the heart of a free society.
That together, with God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us.
So let's
and after all,
transition
why
to
shouldn't
international
we believe
stage
that?
And the other side of this Cold War.
Are Americans.
The Cold War has thawed a bit. The 70s saw a lull in the Cold War. This was called détente, reduction in hostilities. It was a rise in friendliness. Treaties began reducing the number of nukes in the world. So we go from Kennedy and Khrushchev sitting on nukes and arm wrestling to Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev shaking hands over treaties to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in the world. Then the Soviets invade Afghanistan. Second worst idea in history, behind only invading Russia in the winter, of course. In 1978, Afghanistan sees communist revolutions in their very weak government. Most people don't care. Most people in Afghanistan never saw the government. It's a very decentralized state. It's a lot of farmers doing what they do and really not seeing much intervention. But then there were jihadist freedom fighters called the Mujahideen who began fighting to overthrow this government. And because the Soviets saw a communist government trying to be overthrown, they felt that they must intervene to stop the Mujahideen in order to save this communist government. Of course, the truth is far more complicated.
Afghanistan has been in one war or another for the past 38 years. Decades-long conflict is fueled by an ever-increasing cast of local and global characters. The Soviet Union... Afghanistan has been in one war or another for the past 38 years. The decades-long conflict is fueled by an ever-increasing cast of local and global characters. The Soviet Union, the United States, Pakistan, Iran, and Saudi Arabia have all left their mark on Afghanistan. So, how did it all begin? During the Cold War in 1978, the Communist Party led a bloody coup against the nation's first president in the Saud Revolution.
It was not a coup, it was a revolution.
Once in power, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan ran the country with an iron fist. There were curfews, travel bans, mass incarcerations, and repression of dissent. Nearly all levels of society, from academics and politicians to doctors and farmers, joined the resistance against the successive communist governments. By 1979, the Soviet Union stepped in to support the communist government, which was also struggling with internal rifts.
We are grateful to the Soviet Union that they responded positively to our request.
This caught the attention of the West. The United States, with the help of Pakistan and several Arab states, began a covert operation to train and arm the resistance forces, the Mujahideen. Many of these Mujahideen were ordinary Afghan men defending their nation from a foreign invasion. Foreign fighters also came to take up arms against the Soviets. They wanted to end the occupation and bring down the brutal communist government. Some of these Mujahideen would go on to become the country's most notorious warlords. By 1988, the war started to turn in the Mujahideen's favor, due in large part to the arms and training provided by the U.S. and its allies.
To aid the Mujahideen. We send all sorts of weapons and aid to the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets, especially weapons to take down Soviet helicopters, probably the biggest weapon used by the Soviets in Afghanistan. And this includes one Saudi Arabian leader. Look, this anti-Soviet war puts his army on the road to peace. Well, that warrior is Osama bin Laden. In the 1980s, he was a freedom fighter against the Soviets, someone we aided. In 2001, he was the terrorist organizer behind 9/11. It is certainly a massive example to be careful of who you aid now because of what they may become later. That the world is always in flux, and you must keep in mind not just what happens now, but what will happen 25 years from now. Just how different the world can be. And of course, none of this comes to back to bite us. Those arms that we gave the Mujahideen in the 80s were seen on the battlefields of Afghanistan in the 2000s and 2010s. It's kind of a big deal. Got to be careful what the future is going to hold. Well, the Soviets would fight war in Afghanistan from 1978 all the way through 1989. Afghanistan would go back to a weak, independent government. And they really and truly, this was just a super costly war where the Soviets saw no success. This was the Soviet Vietnam, but for them it was far more costly. Because with this, you start to get a number of other things happening all at the same time. There's unrest in Poland. Poles start a workers' union led by Lech Walesa. Lech Walesa would be a key leader for a very long time. The communists tried to crush them, but really they were a labor union. And what is more communist than having a union of workers working to create a new government? Isn't that what the original Soviets were all about? So the Polish continued to resist against the Soviet communists, and they turned this workers' union into a political party called Solidarity. Poland would be granted their own independent elections in 1989, and unexpectedly, they would vote the communists out completely. Lech Walesa leads Poland to be the first country to leave the Soviet sphere of influence. On top of that, the Soviets have a series of old leaders, old, out of touch, dying quickly. I have the official Soviet portrait, and then I have the photo of them, so you can see a little bit of the difference in what people were told and the reality. Leonid Brezhnev dies in 1982. Yuri Andropov is in power for just 2 years before he dies. And Konstantin Chernenko doesn't even make it a full year. These men were very old and very sick, and eventually it's about fresh blood. Mikhail Gorbachev is that fresh blood. And again, if he's fresh blood, that should tell you something. In 1985, he takes over, and he implements two ideas, and you need to know these both. First is perestroika, or restructuring. It reforms the economy. Allow for private business. Allow the Soviets to help one another by selling extra goods. If you make extra stuff from the farm, you should be allowed to sell it. You make extra goods in your workshop, you should be allowed to sell it. Glasnost is the other one. Openness. This is about government. So perestroika is about the economy. Glasnost is about government. Let the people talk openly about Soviet problems, and if people complain about progress, let's hear what they complain about and then fix it. And Glasnost and perestroika are the two ideas that Gorbachev brings to the table to say, yes, we are going to reform and allow the Soviet Union to continue. And Ronald Reagan, he's known as the great communicator for a reason. He understands the moment, and he strikes while the iron is hot, and what it becomes his probably most famous speech.
And now the Soviets themselves may in a limited way be coming to understand the importance of freedom. We hear much from Moscow about a new policy of reform and openness.
And now the Soviets themselves may in a limited way be coming to understand the importance of freedom. We hear much from Moscow about a new policy of reform and openness. Some political prisoners have been released. Certain foreign news broadcasts are no longer being jammed. Some economic enterprises have been permitted to operate with greater freedom from state control. Are these the beginnings of profound changes in the Soviet state, or are they token gestures intended to raise false hopes in the West or to strengthen the Soviet system without changing it? We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
Tear down this wall. Make it a symbol that, yeah, okay, you say you want
Mr.
perestroika, you want
Gorbachev,
restructuring, you want
tear
glasnost, you
down
want
this
openness.
wall.
Well, that's all well and good, but you're still having a wall to keep your people in. Tear down the wall and show you're serious about reform in Russia. 1989, we get mass protests all over East Germany. And the East Germans are asking, how do you stop people from fleeing to Hungary, who has opened its borders, and then to the West? And their answer is different. If you let them travel, if you allow them to go where they want, maybe they'll stay. They'll come back. And so that means to open the wall. But all of this starts with a historic mistake. East Germany agrees to allow passes to the West. And they're going to do this in a very orderly and German way to make sure that everyone took their turns and had their passes and their paperwork ready. But then Günter Schabowski is a politician who was leading a press conference, and he was unclear on the details when he reads this order to the press. He is supposed to say that it will begin at midnight the next day, and therefore allow people to start applying to go to the West. But instead, Günter Schabowski says that it is effective immediately, and that starts a lot of things in motion. Let's take a look at that historic moment.
Und deshalb haben wir uns dazu entschlossen, heute eine Regelung zu treffen, die es jedem Bürger der DDR möglich macht, über Grenzübergangspunkte der DDR. Und deshalb haben wir uns dazu entschlossen, heute eine Regelung zu treffen, die es jedem Bürger der DDR möglich macht, über Grenzübergangspunkte der DDR auszureisen. Das tritt nach meiner Kenntnis ist das sofort, unverzüglich.
We don't know how long this will last. The guards have not been given any instructions. They only see the crowds. This was not expected. So the crowds are demanding to get through, which was illegal just earlier that day. The guards let them pass, and people begin to tear at the wall itself. You get these massive parties atop the Berlin Wall as Germans, East and West, come together for the first time in 30 years. Families that have been torn apart suddenly reunited that night at the wall. From both sides, people celebrate. And then people begin turning their frustration against the wall itself and tearing down pieces. And people begin meeting one another. This is one of those great human moments in history where we see East and West Germans becoming people and reunited as a culture rather than separated by ideologies.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Reporting tonight from Berlin. From the Berlin Wall specifically, take a look at them. They've been there since last night. They are here in the thousands. They are here in the tens of thousands.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Reporting tonight from Berlin.
From the Berlin Wall specifically, take a look at them. They've been there since last night. They are here in the thousands. They are here in the tens of thousands. Occasionally they shout, Die Mauer muss weg, the wall must go. Thousands and thousands of West Germans come to make the point that the wall has suddenly become irrelevant. Something, as you can see, almost to party on. How do you measure such an astonishing moment in history? The East German government said tonight they were going to make more openings in the wall, at least a dozen more. Put bulldozers right through the wall so that more people could cross to the west. The East German communist leadership tonight said there'd be a new election law guaranteeing secret elections which the rest of the world could monitor. And only 24 hours after East Germans were told they could go anywhere, anytime, the Soviet Union said that was a sensible move.
Thousands of East Germans came across the border today, perhaps more than 100,000, so many that border police lost count. And at every border crossing, thousands of West Germans there to say welcome. Some of the really good news today was for the East German government. While thousands and thousands came to look, even gape at this showcase of capitalism, the vast majority said they would be going back. The simple act of giving people the freedom to travel may have convinced East Germans they need not take flight whenever the door opens just a fraction. It has been an astonishing day. Hour after hour, all through today, thousands and thousands of West Germans have come to the wall to see for themselves, to climb up on this hideous structure, to finally look down at what has been no man's land for so long. Finally, after all these years, to say in person what they think of the East German border guards. Or try to make friends. Suddenly, a flashback to what it was like for so long. A young man in the East makes a dash for the wall. They catch him and take him away. Presumably, he should have used a legal border crossing. Only a couple of years ago, he might have been shot. Not today. Today, it was possible to have a dialogue.
Your government seems to be changing every day. Where do you think it's going?
That's the government's problem, he says, not mine. Such an astonishing moment in history.
Now, what's it feel like to be standing on top of the wall?
It's incredible for me. It's I can't describe really my feelings. It's something unreal for me.
If there is someone who sleeps for 8 weeks and you told him what happened here, he thinks you're crazy. It's unthinkable.
Unthinkable. Tonight at the border crossings, including Checkpoint Charlie, which is normally a crossing for non-Germans only, there was still a block-long gauntlet of goodwill. Here, as everywhere else, it is one breathtaking moment after another. The new arrivals in their tiny, smoke-belching cars were greeted like athletes, patted on the back and cheered forward, sometimes pushed forward. Many of the East Germans were stunned by it all.
And so Germany will reunite.
I've been waiting 28 years for this, he told us. Will you come permanently, we asked? How long will you stay? I haven't much money, he said, but I'll stay till I run out of gas.
Over its own republics. Adding fuel to that fire, the USSR is going broke. For years, the U.S. has been very publicly working on a missile defense system called the Strategic Defense Initiative, though it was better known in the press as Star Wars. The idea being that Reagan wanted a very complicated system of lasers and satellites to shoot down any ICBMs coming to attack the United States. This really violates mutually assured destruction, and so it makes it so that the U.S. could attack Russia, but Russia could not attack the U.S., which what would that make the U.S. want to do? Attack Russia. And so any missile defense system to the present day is a very sore point for the Russians. We saw that a lot under George W. Bush. The USSR tries to keep up with this idea, and between SDI and Afghanistan, the Soviet Union is broke. We do get a lot of great cartoons and ideas out of it, including a couple of video games. But yeah, SDI never actually works. It was just a lot of money thrown at a problem, and the Soviets tried to keep up, and they couldn't. 1989 would be a big year in history. The Russians would leave Afghanistan with no victory. Poland gets independent elections. Hungary would follow and get independent elections. It removes the border restrictions, and the East Germans run there so that they could run to the West. East Germany gets rid of their 20-year leader, which leads to the Berlin Wall being torn down. And Romania would overthrow its communist dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu. Overall, it is a very bad year for communism. And in 1991, we get the official end. So Gorbachev was the leader of the Soviet Union. It's an attempted coup, tries to overthrow him to try and bring all of those countries back in. Gorbachev says, too bad, he is stepping down. The government votes to dissolve itself, and now the Soviet Union is no more. All of those various socialist republics can do whatever they want, and that's where we get the modern map with all of those breakaway republics of Kazakhstan, of Ukraine and Belarus, of Georgia and Azerbaijan, and so on, along with independent Russia. So the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, decides to lead by example. He promotes friendliness among the former Soviet nations, including one last gold medal as a hockey team in 1992. They played as a unified former Soviet countries. There'd be many economic problems because, well, how do you uncommunist a country? For 80 years, you have been telling people what jobs they are going to take and what they're going to do and where they're going to live, and all of a sudden, all of that's gone. And if all these businesses that aren't propped up by the government, suddenly they're not getting any money from the government and they collapse. And so people are homeless and jobless, and there's a lot of anarchy. Vladimir Putin has helped fix Russia's economy with this, a lot of it by taking more and more control. There's been a lot of shady deals. Most of Russia is run by a small group of businessmen, very wealthy, rich businessmen, mostly selling natural resources. There are many instances where his competitors meet suspicious deaths. A lot of people get killed in very suspicious ways. There's a loophole in the presidential term. So Russia's constitution says that you can only have 2 terms. And you can only have 2 consecutive terms. But it doesn't say that that's all the terms you can have forever and ever. So Putin has had 2 presidential terms, and then he took a term off and was prime minister while someone else was president, Dmitry Medvedev. And really Medvedev had very little power, and Putin was suddenly the prime minister is the most important one. Then Putin runs for election as president again, and all of a sudden the president's most important power again. And now he has just won his second term. And one assumes at the end of this term, he'll either decide to retire or he'll be prime minister again before having another 2 presidential terms. All of this has been accomplished because Russia has gotten very strict. There is very little freedom as far as what we would recognize it. And of course, they still don't like us. And there's certainly a lot of questions on how much influence they have in recent elections. As our elections become more and more electronics based and we learn our news electronically, there's a lot of questions. You know, of course, Vlad would never steer us wrong. So we're going to keep this one short, and I'm going to end it at the fall of the Soviet Union. I'm going to give you just a couple more notes that you should take down because these things definitely should be on the SOL. I would not be surprised in the slightest. We will go over them much more in depth, but there are some things that I feel that we should do in person. So George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president, will be elected. He continues Reagan's ideas. The first Gulf War happens, where we go into war thinking it's going to be a massive invasion and the next world war, but really it's over in just a matter of weeks when we invade Iraq because they had invaded Kuwait. We liberate Kuwait. Saddam Hussein is not taken down, but he is weakened. But most importantly, we get a win in a war that's on foreign soil. And that's the first win in a war we've had since Vietnam. And that really shakes a lot of the fears that we had since Vietnam. And that's important. Bill Clinton would be elected as a shift towards the political center. He is a center-left Democrat. For the first time since, I think, Thomas Jefferson, we get a budget surplus in that the government was using less money than it was taking in. That would be gone shortly after his presidency. We get a lot of improvements, but not solutions to many rights issues. We get Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which allows homosexuals in the military as long as they don't talk about it. Not a fix, but a step in the right direction. We get CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Plan, so that kids can have health insurance paid for by the government if their parents can't afford it. It's not a fix for Medicare for all, or as we're talking about now, or even health care for most Americans, but it's a push in the right direction. There's a lot of those things. We also get NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which allows for no tariffs between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. It's why a lot of our cars are made in Windsor, Ontario, or in Mexico City, Mexico, and we bring them here and we still put Made in America stickers on them. It has been replaced by President Trump, but with something that looks very, very similar. And Bill Clinton, perhaps most importantly, or at least what he's most remembered for, he is impeached from the presidency, but he is not removed. Remember, impeach means only to bring charges, which means Bill Clinton and Andrew Johnson are the only 2 presidents impeached, and Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency, never was impeached. We'll talk about why and the details of that in class. Finally, George W. Bush wins the Electoral College, but not the popular vote in 2000. That's a very messy situation involving a lot of court battles. It tries to push back towards Reaganism, but most things are stymied because of 9/11. 9/11 2001 is the deadliest day in American history when terrorists used airplanes, civilian airliners, to attack the World Trade Center buildings in New York and the Pentagon here in Washington. And it's changed everything. Just everything has changed because of 9/11. We begin the war on terror, which is an invasion of Afghanistan and later Iraq, a preemptive strike against Saddam Hussein for harboring terrorism in his state. We get much more security. The Patriot Act allows for the government to collect records on us, which will lead to a lot of wiretapping in the NSA and all sorts of things that we are still dealing with. And we also get a lot of changing views on immigration. There's a lot more immigration happening, especially from Latin America, as people are seeking the American dream. It is, in reality, no different than what we saw in the Industrial Revolution. It's just a different area of the world where most of these immigrants are coming from. And, of course, the standard anti-immigrant sentiment flares up. There's a lot of people trying to limit it. George W. Bush will erect a fence along the southern border. That was very controversial, and I'm sure you can see how all of that is still playing out today. Barack Obama would be elected after George W. Bush. It's a push for more left ideas, and we'll talk about those things in class as well. So hopefully you've gotten notes from all of these, or at the very least have watched all of these, so that you are ready for the SOL. We'll talk about the modern era, we'll talk about the space race, and we'll have little activities to begin all these as we're going in class. So stay tuned, and good luck.